Good evening, everyone, and happy Historic Preservation Month and happy Frankfort Heritage Week. My name is Vicki Birenberg, and I am the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Frankfort. And I am with you this evening to talk a little bit about how to identify and describe historic residential buildings. Before I get started, I want to spend a minute expressing my appreciation to a number of people who have really been instrumental in kind of pulling this week's events together. First of all, I'd like to thank the Franklin County Trust for Historic Preservation, particularly the president, John Carlton, who has worked very hard to put together a schedule of both educational and recreational programming. And it's really been a monumental week of great events. So I thank him for all his hard work. And I'd like to thank my colleagues at City Hall, particularly Jordan Miller, senior planner, who I get to work very closely with, who has offered a great deal of support kind of behind the scenes to get the city-sponsored events ready for the public this week. And in fact, he's my man behind the curtain tonight, helping me with this Zoom session, which I would not be able to do by myself. So thank you, Jordan. I appreciate you very much. I'd also like to thank Russ Hatter, the city historian, who is always so prompt in getting me information when I'm looking for it. And I appreciate his contributions to tonight, as well as the members of the ARB, who are really embracing their role to promote preservation, education, and outreach in Frankfort, especially Nicole Conkle, the ARB chair, who has put together a special recording that will be shown tonight on the city's Facebook page after my presentation ends. And the topic of her presentation is public archaeology. And finally, I would like to give a shout out to, to my friend, Bill McIntyre, former colleague at the Kentucky Heritage Council. He was a longtime survey coordinator there. And I have used a number of his house plan illustrations in my presentation tonight. So thank you, Bill, so much for helping me to make this as good as it can be. So let's get to the main question. Is it Colonial or Foursquare? And sometimes it's both. That's the answer to the question. As in this example from 1912, this is kind of a classic Foursquare type house with colonial revival detailing. And the point I'm really trying to make here is that there are a couple different ways we can go about describing historic buildings. We can describe them by style, using words like Victorian or colonial or modern, or we can describe them by type or plan, which has more to do with their form and maybe the arrangements of the rooms inside the house. Both can be associated with different points in our history, and few, if any, types are associated with only one style. And then there's something we call vernacular architecture, where sometimes using the type of house can be more descriptive. Vernacular architecture is regional. It's reflective of local traditions. It's usually built of local materials, using local knowledge and construction methods. And oftentimes these houses are very simple and not overly ornamented. So I'm going to begin by talking through some various house types, beginning with the early settlement period in Kentucky and probably in Franklin County as well. And the first houses, of course, were very simple, one-room structures, typically made of logs. And we refer to those as single pens. Rooms are called pens. So a single pen plan is just one room. And that one room actually might be divided, but with a partition, into two rooms, one called a hall and one called a parlor. And the hall might be a little bit larger and where most of the daily activity takes place. And then as houses expanded, you know, they became two-room houses. And there are a couple of different varieties of those. Double pen basically means two rooms side by side. Typically in a double pen house, you see a door to the exterior in each room. The one underneath here is referred to as a saddlebag. And that's because you've got one room that hangs on each side of a central fireplace. Have you heard of the dog trot plan? That's when you have two rooms covered by a common roof, but they're separated by this breezeway in the center. And then there's something called the T plan, which is called that, as you might be able to figure out, because it kind of looks like the letter T, right, sitting on its side. And Frankfurt has a number of T-plan houses. These are also sometimes referred to as gable and wing type houses. And you can see that they're all expressed stylistically a little bit differently, right? And they can be one-story plans or two-story plans. These houses are all in South Frankfurt. There's another type of early house called the I house. And this is not because the plan is shaped like the letter I, actually. It's called the I house because it was commonly found in the rural areas of Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, right? And this particular house has two rooms separated by a central passage, but it's only one room deep, and it typically has two stories. Here's an example of an I house in Frankfurt on Steel Street. This house does have some later additions added to it, but it began its form as that basic rectangular shape. You can see some influences of the Greek Revival style on this house. Interestingly, this house was once occupied by Robert Franklin, who was the prosecuting attorney in the assassination trials of Governor Goebel. And I'm sure you probably have heard of the shotgun, right? Which is so named because you can stand on the porch here and shoot your gun and have the ammunition go straight through to the back door. And this collection of shotguns is located on 2nd Street in South Frankfurt. There's another descriptive term we use when we're talking about housing types, especially early types. And that word is pile, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. It refers to the depth of the structure. So the I house is a single pile plan. It's one room deep. Over here, we have the plan for the RTP Allen House, which is located out near Big Eddy, and it is a double pile plan. You can see two rooms on this side, two rooms on this side, central passage, and porches on each side. And here's a picture of this house that was taken in 1979 when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This house is significant because it is constructed of poured concrete. Oh, can't speak, poured concrete. And it was constructed in 1830, which is very, very early for a poured concrete structure. In fact, in the nomination, it's documented as the earliest poured concrete house in the state. Poured concrete didn't come into widespread use as a building material until after 1870. So those are some types associated with early settlement in the 19th century. What kind of types are associated with the 20th century? Well, there are several, right? And I'll begin with the ubiquitous bungalow. Bungalow comes from an Indian word meaning small house with porches all around. And in the United States, it's typically 1 or 1.5 stories, and it does have at least one porch. Bungalows became very popular when the middle class was exploding at the first part of the 20th century. And that happened to coincide with the popularity of the American arts and crafts movement. So you find many bungalows built in the craftsman style. But there are lots of other styles that were used for bungalows as well. as you can see from this picture. Well, many pictures. I clipped these images from early house plan catalogs from the early 20th century. These are all bungalows, but they're all built with a little bit of a different style to them. And back to the Foursquare, right? Foursquare is a house type. It's basically a box, 4 rooms over 4 rooms, and it almost always has a hipped roof, but it can express itself stylistically in a variety of ways. And a number of these examples actually are in both North and South Frankfurt. And then there is the ranch, sometimes called the Rambler. Very popular in the middle of the 20th century, and it hung on for quite some time, right? This particular house is low slung, very horizontal. We have 2 examples here. They both have very similar plans to them. However, one is expressed more as a colonial revival style house. The other one is much more mid-century modern. If you're really interested in the topic of residential architectural house styles, I highly recommend that you get your hands on a copy of this book, A Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia McAllister. When you're in my line of work, everybody pretty much owns this book, and we refer to it frequently. And I actually relied on it heavily for my presentation tonight. So what I've done is I've taken McAllister's historic timeline for residential architecture, and I've condensed it a bit into these 5 broad categories, each with its own set of subcategories. And I'm going to try to cover the period from 1700 to 1970. And I know this is only supposed to be an hour-long presentation, so I apologize if I use all my time. I know Jordan did say that he'd be happy to stick around for a little Q&A if we go over. But anyway, I apologize in advance. It's a big topic. And I also want to mention that, you know, you can't get caught up into assigning a style to a house every single time, because not very many things are that architecturally pure. Lots of times they're hybrids of a variety of styles, especially when they're built during certain time periods, like this building, which is an apartment building in South Frankfurt. It's very handsome. I love to admire it. I would be hard pressed to determine exactly what style this is, though. I know it was built in the 20s, and it borrows from a whole bunch of stylistic influences from that time. It's kind of got this long horizontal expression to it with this ceramic tile roof. And that, combined with these wide overhanging eaves and brackets here, make me think of the Italian Renaissance revival style. But it's also very kind of chunky, right? It's got a lot of mass to it, and it's got these ribbons of windows that I think kind of borrow from the prairie style, or maybe a little from arts and craftsmen. And then in addition to that, you see this kind of portico here with some classical detailing. And I know the doorway is obscured in this picture, but it's a classical entrance with, I think, a fan light above it. That's very colonial revival. And then, you know, what is this exactly? I'm not sure. It looks almost like some reference to half timbering. And then you see these diamond paned windows up here in the dormer. Well, that's Tudor revival style. So this is really a mishmash, and it's a beautiful building, but it's a lot of different styles. So I'm going to start in the colonial era with the early houses of Kentucky, and we're going to start with Georgian, right? This style was named for the Georges of England. It's simple, it's very box-like, it's symmetrical. It's got 2 rooms on each side, and it's 2 rooms deep, and it's got a central hall, and it's pretty consistent with its ornamentation. The example I've got here on this slide is the Vess Lindsay house. There was a virtual tour of that house, I believe, today as part of Heritage Week. I hope you all checked it out. This house is very old. It was built before 1820, and it is a Georgian style house. And as you move through the Georgian period and you get to the late period, that simplicity is starting to become more embellished. And those more embellished houses we refer to as federal style. They have a little more elaborate detailing. The doorway is maybe more accentuated. Sometimes it includes a portico. The dormers might include things like arched windows. You might see a Palladian window like this one here. Federal houses are more likely to have wings and dependencies added onto them. And they're also sometimes referred to as Adam style houses, and that's a reference to Robert Adam, who was a classical architect working in Britain, who did a lot to kind of advance the use of this style and make it popular. Of course, one of the best examples in Frankfurt is Liberty Hall, built in 1796. And then we get to the early classical revival, which is very much tied to Thomas Jefferson, right? This is not a very common style. It's concentrated in the South, primarily in Virginia, as you might imagine. We know that Mr. Jefferson fancied himself as an architect, and he designed his home, which is pictured here, Monticello. And one of the key features of this style is this very dominating front portico over the entrance with this pediment, and it may have this little lunette window and these classical columns in the front. We have a regional example close to Frankfurt in Farmington, which was a hemp plantation built in 1815. I'm moving out of the colonial era now and into the romantic era of residential architecture, beginning with Greek revival. This style really dominated the first half of the 19th century because it was the architectural representation of our new country's democratic ideals, right? It was spread all over the country through the use of builder manuals, such as American Builder's Companion, written by the architect Asher Benjamin, which was essentially a pattern book, right? And local builders and carpenters would use it and copy the plans inside. The hallmarks of this style, well, they're very much like a Greek temple, right? Very rectangular floor plans. They can have a gabled or hipped roof. Built of either masonry or wood. There are a variety of porch options. You might see a full facade porch. You might see a full height porch. You might see a half height porch. Sometimes there are no porches. A heavy cornice is another typical feature of the style. And sometimes you see these engaged columns called pilasters. And the porch is typically almost always supported by classical columns. This example here is Ward Hall in Georgetown, which is a fabulous example of Greek revival architecture, and I really encourage you to visit if you have never been. But we also have some very fine examples of Greek revival here in Frankfurt, including the Orlando Brown House, which was built in 1835 by Gideon Chirac, who is one of the prominent architects that worked in Kentucky in this style. And there are many other fine examples of Greek revival in the neighborhood around the Orlando Brown House. Moving on to the Gothic revival, right? This style was associated with the movement toward picturesque country houses in England, and it was considered a rural style, very compatible with the natural landscape. And in the United States, it was promoted by two men, Alexander Jackson Davis, who was an architect, and Andrew Jackson Downing, who was a landscape designer, and they collaborated together to produce a book called Cottage Residences, which was essentially a pattern book of houses built in this style. Gothic Revival typically has a very vertical orientation. There are lots of gables, and they're typically decorated with this verge board underneath. You might see windows with pointed Gothic arches on them. The emphasis on verticality sometimes extended to the type of siding put on the house. You'd see board and batten siding, which is a type of vertical siding. Sometimes there's castellated detailing, which means it kind of looks like a castle. If you've ever been to the Loudon House in Lexington, you know what I'm talking about. And the vernacular examples of this style are referred to as Carpenter Gothic. Of course, that style was immortalized in this work by Grant Wood. You can see here actually the example of that board and batten siding on the house. And Frankfort has many examples of Gothic revival, which is a little surprising because it was not a super popular style. Including the Thomas Todd House over here, which is located across the street from the library. Although I read in the Corner and Celebrities National Register nomination that this house was not always Gothic revival, and you can kind of tell because the entrance is very classical with this fanlight above it. So I think it started life as the Federal style house and got a Gothic makeover at some point, which was very common. People remodeled their houses in the past, just as they do today. Another Romantic era style that was associated with the picturesque movement was Italianate. And the picturesque movement was really kind of a reaction against classicism in both art and architecture. So what you have with the Italianate style is kind of, again, this informal, rambling Italian farmhouse theme. And it was very popular. And by 1860, it completely overshadowed the Gothic revival. The defining characteristics of this style, well, you can typically identify them, or I do anyway, by the little brackets, right, up underneath the eaves. That's a very common Italianate feature. These houses are generally kind of cubic. They have a heavy massing of 2 or 3 stories. They're often asymmetrical. Many have a tower or a cupola, right? You need that to look out over the Tuscan landscape. The most common roof type is hipped. And this example, actually, which is up in Tanglewood, is Point Breeze. It is the home of the prominent educator B.B. Sayre, who operated the Sayre Institute. And I find it interesting because, again, this is a hybrid. There's a lot of classical detailing on this Italianate house, including this door with its fanlight and side lights and the dentil molding here and all the little panes in the windows. But Frankfort has many examples of Italianate residential architecture. And what you typically find on the windows are these hoods that present themselves in a variety of ways, different styles. And the window configuration is usually 2 panes over 2 panes, and they're long and vertical. This is the Sig Lusher house. You can see it has its double door entry, which is also a common feature of the Italianate style. And down here in the corner, we have the Emily Thomas Tubman house, right? I think this might be one that was also Federal style and then got a later makeover to add those Italianate features. Okay, so we're moving out of the Romantic era and into the Victorian era. And the term Victorian is very broad when you use it to describe a house, right? And I mean, it's as broad as using the term colonial. Queen Victoria's reign in Britain lasted from 1837 to 1901. But generally speaking, in regards to American architecture, we typically refer to Victorian houses as those that were popular from 1860 to 1890. There were a lot of different things going on in our country that contributed to the popularity of Victorian architecture. There was rapid industrialization, growth of the railroad, widespread use of the balloon frame as opposed to post and beam construction. All these things worked greatly to expand upon that idea of style in regards to housing. And, simplifying construction techniques allowed houses not to be just boxes anymore, and they took on a lot of complex shapes and forms. This is a house built in the Second Empire style, which is a French style, actually, and it refers to the empire of Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon I. Napoleon III is remembered for the rebuilding of Paris into a city of grand boulevards. And this is the style that popularized the mansard roof, right? This kind of flat, flared design feature. It was very, very popular for civic buildings, less so for houses. Although it does have that unfortunate association, I think, with haunted houses, maybe because it was the style of the creepy house behind the Bates Motel in the movie Psycho. I'm sure that contributed. But in any case, it was not a common style for residential architecture. It's very heavy, very highly ornamented. Here are some examples from other parts of the country, because I don't think we have any single family home residential Second Empire styles in Frankfurt. This one over here on the left, though, is actually in Lexington. We do have some examples that show some Second Empire detailing in our mixed-use buildings downtown. However, this little collection here is on St. Clair. And then there are the buildings we've lost, right? Here's one that was built in Second Empire style. Russ Hatter got this information for me. This was in the 200 block of West Main Street. This building was originally built as a two-story building in 1869, and it was remodeled into a three-story building. It suffered fire and being rebuilt. It was the Kenyon Hotel in the 1880s, I believe. And I just love this advertisement. It shows the entire front facade here. But what I find so intriguing is this part. It says, the most popular hotel in the city, special rates to drummers. What is that about? I really would love to know. But in any case, the Kenyon Hotel became the Fleming Hotel in 1904, and then the Frankfort Hotel in 1906. And then in 1962, there was a tragic fire and it burned and it was razed shortly after that. So this one is no longer with us, but it was a very handsome building. The stick style is actually a transitional style between the Italian age and the later Queen Anne Victorian. And stick style is called that because of the application of decoration on the exterior walls, kind of like half timbering that you might see in medieval English buildings, right? Not serving any structural purpose though, just for decoration. You might see horizontal, vertical, and diagonal bands raised from the wall surfaces. These houses had a very tall and narrow orientation. You might find decorative trusses in the gables. Sometimes there are towers present. And the later period was really highly embellished under the influence of Charles Eastlake. He was the Martha Stewart of the 19th century, and he published a book called Hints on Household Taste, and it was very, very influential on home design. Here are some other examples from around the country of stick style, and you can see that decoration. But we have some of this in Frankfurt too. There's an example here from on Ewing Street on the left, and on the right, this example is on Conway. And as I was putting this presentation together, I learned something I did not know, which I think is very exciting to share with you all. This house on Conway is actually built from plans that were purchased from a catalog that was put together by an architect by the name of George Barber. He was a self-taught architect. He was a carpenter, kind of turned architect, And he published all these catalogs of home designs, and people built them all over the country. And in fact, there are people who, travel and try to identify all the Barber houses they can. So we have one here in Frankfurt, and this is design number 15. And if you look closely, you can see, if you're looking at this section here, this projecting gable and the design here, and the recessed porches here and here, and especially this little detail right here, which is a diagonal wall with a window in it, a little hood over the top, right? You can see it in plan form here. If I go back one, you can see that right here. Here's the little hood. The wall is diagonal, although you can't really see it in the picture. The detailing on the exterior is not exactly the same, but very similar. But that happens when you buy a house plan. You kind of put your own spin on it. And another difference I noticed is the position of the chimney and the shape of the roof. But again, it was not uncommon to make modifications to the plans that you purchased. And then we move into the Queen Anne style. This is probably the one that most people recognize because it's the one with the turrets, right? The style was developed in Britain by a group of architects led by Richard Norman Shaw. I'm not really sure why it's named Queen Anne. She reigned at the beginning of the 1700s, and I don't think this style has anything to do with styles that were popular at that time. But in any case, the characteristics of Queen Anne architecture is kind of an asymmetry in the massing, very complex roof lines, often with a hipped roof and cross gables. There's a combination of materials used on the exterior, wood and brick and stone, sometimes all together. And you'll see bay windows, curved windows, sometimes half timbering. Chimneys are generally very tall and decorative with ribbing like this at the top. And another thing, the windows. Queen Anne houses often have a window that is a single pane of glass with the little squares of colored glass all around the perimeter. Frankfurt has a fine example of Queen Anne style architecture in the Gooch House on 2nd Street. And there was a subtype of Queen Anne that became more popular towards the end of the Victorian era called Free Classic. And it kind of coincided with the rise of popularity of colonial revival, right? So what you see are these classic details combined on a Queen Anne house. You might see classical columns, maybe grouped in units of 2 or 3. You might see a Palladian window, maybe some dental molding, maybe a pediment over the porch. And we have some examples of that in Frankfurt too, actually. There's this really sweet little bungalow on St. Clair that's got this kind of prominent pedimented gable in the front and classic style columns on the porch. And then there is this example on 3rd Street. Again, we've got a pediment here on the porch entry, highly decorated, either composite or Corinthian columns on the porch. And I see a Palladian window up here. Another residential style, which we're not going to find in Frankfurt, unfortunately, is based on the Romanesque revival style of architecture, which was more commonly used for civic and commercial buildings. But there was an architect named Henry Hobson Richardson who took this style and adapted it to residential architecture, right? And these houses are massive. They're always made of masonry, usually rusticated masonry. They have a lot of ornate detailing on the stonework. Usually it incorporates arches or arcades. The windows might be recessed and you might see like little colonnettes on each side. And it was common to incorporate turrets on this style too. This is the Conrad Caldwell House Museum in Louisville. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. And again, we don't really have a residential style in Frankfurt that I can show you, but we do have a very fine example of Romanesque revival architecture in our Masonic Lodge downtown on Ann Street. Another Victorian style that kind of rose to popularity at the end of that era was the shingle style, and it's the casual Victorian style. It was inspired by fishing cottages, which actually is really ironic because it was one of the favorite styles in exclusive locations occupied by very wealthy people on the upper Atlantic coast at the turn of the century, places like Newport, Rhode Island. But, you know, actually the shingle, wood shingle material is considered to be a more modest material than wood clapboards. And this style is kind of the beginning of the turn away from excessive ornamentation on the exterior and more of an emphasis on the beauty of the materials themselves, which was one of the tenets of the arts and crafts movement, which kind of overlaps with the development of this style. Here are some other shingle style examples. You can see that the style commonly incorporates a gambrel roof. And we have a fine shingle style example in Frankfurt up on Todd Street. And the last of the Victorian styles I'll talk about is folk Victorian. This is generally poor man's Victorian, right? It's the embellishment of small house types with Victorian detailing. And this was made possible, again, by that mass production of decorative detailing that I referred to earlier. You could order it out of catalog and put it on your house and really give it some style. So this proliferated with the growth of the railroad system and ease of access. I think this house actually, it's in South Frankfurt. I think it might be on Shelby Street. So we've kind of reached the turn of the century and there's something happening at this point, right? We've got a group of people who are kind of looking to the past for their architectural inspiration. And then there's another group of people that are looking towards the future. And we're going to talk a little bit first about the people who are looking backwards. There were a few things going on at that time. First of all, we had the 100-year birthday celebration of our country in 1876, and there was a large celebration, the Philadelphia Centennial, that kind of renewed interest in that architecture associated with our colonial period. And then in 1893, we had the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the World's Fair, the White City. That's where this picture comes from. And the classic styles were chosen to kind of be the theme of the fair. And everything was white and it was dazzling and it was very inspiring, and hundreds of thousands of people visited, and it had a great influence on the direction of architecture afterwards. So people were interested once again in correct historic interpretations of European styles from the past. And so we got this long period, really, that lasts, 80 years, 70 years at least, of revivalism, revisiting those styles, all these different styles, right? Including colonial revival, which is still with us and will probably always be, right? But you can see how it evolved over the decades. Beginning in 1890, the early colonial revival houses look very Victorian, right? They have the same kind of Victorian massing. What you see is symmetry. Suddenly, things are centered and there's classical detailing apparent, but essentially it still looks very much like a Victorian house. And then, the style is refined and evolves. And then by 1940, you've got this very rectangular, simplified, Georgian-looking box that has been stripped of all its ornamentation, probably due to the influence of modernism. Frankfurt's got great colonial revival architecture. I love this sweet little example over on Ewing Street. I think this was probably built between 1925 and 1945. It's got a lot of really high quality materials on it, which I appreciate, including a slate roof. And then we have this lovely example up on Conway. This was designed by Leo Oberwarth, who was one of Frankfurt's most premier architects. I love this house. It's just so beautiful. It's got this beautiful gambrel roof, these large oversized dormers with this classical kind of pediment here and the Palladian windows and the classical columns on the front. And this picture I didn't take in Frankfurt, but I could have, because these exist everywhere, right? By the mid-century, we had the Colonial Revival style ranch house, and there are lots and lots of examples of it all over the country. And the same thing with neoclassical, right? That had a really long revival run. The early examples were probably very closely inspired by the White City, going through the decades. And then you get to the mid-century. This example is in Frankfurt. It's on Weehawken Lane, and it was built in the 1950s. Beaux-Arts was another classical revival style. It's French. It's kind of a reference to France's premier school of architecture, the École de Beaux-Arts. It's a classical style with very heavy ornamentation. It was a favorite style of those industrial barons at the turn of the century, and it was widely used for civic and commercial buildings. Our local Beaux-Arts example is our governor's mansion in South Frankfurt. Chateauesque, loosely based on the monumental 16th century chateaus in France. This was another style that was associated with the Gilded Age, and probably the best known example in the country is the Biltmore Mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. We don't have any French chateau residences in Frankfurt that I know of, but we do have our old post office and customs house, which is very Chateauesque influenced. The Tudor Revival style, it also had a long run. And all these examples are from South Frankfurt. This is another style with very vertical orientation, kind of based on those English precedents. Of course, the English call Tudor Revival mock Tudor. And they are built with a variety of materials, stone and brick and wood and stucco with the half timbering, except that on the revival styles, it's not structural, it's just decorative. And they usually have a prominent chimney. Italian Renaissance revival. This was a Mediterranean style. You don't see much of it in Kentucky, to be honest, or at least I have not. I used to see it much more frequently when I lived in the Chicago area. The pure examples are large and very horizontal. They have ceramic tile roofs. They're usually light in color. And you might see arcades and recessed entrances and arched windows and that sort of thing. Here's an example of a small house in my old Chicago suburb. You can see it's very influenced by this style with its tiled roof and arcaded windows. And it was also a style borrowed from heavily, along with the prairie style and craftsman style, to decorate the locally popular Chicago bungalow. So when you're in Chicago and you're looking at the bungalows there, and they are prolific, you're probably going to see some that have Italian Renaissance revival influence. Mission style. This is so named for the mission dormer or parapet wall that is usually featured on the front facade somewhere. These are usually coated in stucco, and Frankfurt has a very special example on Capitol Avenue. And this is special not just because it's a rare style, but it's also a kit house from Sears, the Alhambra. Spanish Revival architecture, borrowed from the entire catalog and history of Spanish architecture. And we have an example of that in South Frankfurt too, up on Shelby Street. French Eclectic. This style was really popular between World War I and II. We had a lot of architects and builders that served in World War I, and they became familiar with the historic precedent, the originals of this style, and they came home and kind of popularized the revival. These typically have a hipped roof, sometimes have a turret or tower. You might see half timbering, right? Usually have a massive chimney. Some examples are actually very symmetrical, like this one. I am not aware of any examples of this style in Frankfurt. I would love to find one. So if anybody out there knows one, please let me know where it is so I can document it. So that's looking backwards, right? What about the people who were looking in a different direction? Early modernism at the early part of the 20th century kind of evolved in reaction to the excesses of the Victorian era and the industrial age, right? Beginning with the arts and crafts movement, which began in England. And architecturally, it was expressed by a simplification of ornament and a focus on handcraft and beauty of materials and their texture and exposed construction techniques. English arts and crafts style is simplified from Victorian precedent. The roofs might be complicated and multi-gabled, right? But the exterior surfaces are often smooth stucco. There may be decorative brackets under the eaves. Front doors may have elaborate decorative handmade hardware, including strap hinges. And we actually have an example of English arts and crafts style in Frankfurt up on Todd Street. I don't think it's this color anymore. I took this picture several years ago, but this is truly one of my favorite houses in South Frankfurt. On American soil, the arts and crafts movement kind of got distilled through the promotion of a furniture maker and publisher whose name was Gustav Stickley. And he published a magazine at the first part of the 20th century called The Craftsman. And it was very popular during that time. He sold house plans. But he also promoted an entire lifestyle built around the tenets of the arts and crafts movement, right? Which included focusing on nature and a connection to the outdoors, simplifying your life, having dignity in your work, and focusing on the handmade. And this became the dominant style for smaller houses that were built in the United States during this period. Their features typically include low-pitched roofs with overhanging eaves. You'll probably see these decorative brackets in the eaves. You'll also notice a little decoration here. The fly rafters are often notched, and you might see exposed rafter tails like this. Windows are typically grouped. There are a variety of materials used on the exterior. Again, wood, brick, stucco, stone. And this particular style also had regional variations depending on where they were located in the country. Here are some Frankfurt examples, and there are so many. I had trouble choosing. I could put a few pages here together and we could look at all of them. They're all lovely and they're all different. And, you know, the prairie style, which was overlapped with that time period, it originated in Chicago, but it was also very influenced by the arts and crafts movement, particularly the connection to nature. Frank Lloyd Wright is considered the master of this style, and the architects that he worked with became known as the Prairie School. The key features, this kind of low, heavy, horizontal massing, it kind of just looks like it's rooted to the ground, right? Like it just kind of emerged from the soil. They generally have horizontal emphasis and a low pitched or flat roof, massive chimneys, and horizontal bands of windows that often contain art glass. This is the Jesse Ziegler house. It's on Shelby Street. It's very special, not just to Frankfurt, but all of Kentucky, because it is the only documented example of Frank Lloyd Wright's work in the state. But his influence was being felt just around the corner on Campbell Street, because we have this lovely Leo Oberwerth design house that is very prairie influenced in its horizontality. Is that a word? It's got these great horizontal lines, bands of windows, and you can see the prairie influence, but it's also a hybrid. It's got some colonial revival detailing going on, although even that has been stretched very horizontally. Modernistic styles. These were the ones that did not rely on the past at all for inspiration. The Art Deco style actually is not typically a residential style at all. It's associated more with skyscrapers and commercial buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building in New York. It came out of Paris, the Exhibition of Decorative Arts in 1925, and it incorporated a lot of decorative motifs, right? Including chevrons, sunrise patterns, geometric florals, ziggurat shapes. And unfortunately, we don't have examples in Frankfurt of residential architecture. So I pulled these for you to look at. This cute little bungalow, I have a feeling it's in Miami somewhere because there's a lot of deco architecture there, but I just have never seen anything like this. And then the one on the bottom I wanted to share because it is, well, it's got a pedigree. This was built in 1928 in the Art Deco style. Which it also is sometimes referred to as Mayan Revival Art Deco, I think because of the ornamentation here on this copper detailing. But it's also kind of horizontal, right? And the architect is Lloyd Wright, who was Frank Lloyd Wright's son. Frankfurt has a great example of Art Deco, though, in our state office building downtown. It's a beautiful building. Art moderne is one of my favorite styles. It is just so fun. The idea of modern became influenced by industrial design for ships and airplanes and automobiles. And so this style exhibits smooth surfaces, curved corners, and a horizontal emphasis, all to give the impression of speed and aerodynamics. You'll generally see flat roof lines with some coping at the top, smooth wall surfaces. A lot of these incorporate the use of glass block and sometimes little round porthole windows like you might see on a ship. Here's a regional example I found in Louisville. And now we come to the international style. This style developed under European modern influence between the wars from the work of architects like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe. It's a very geometric style. All the superfluous ornament is removed from the exterior. Windows are kind of sometimes set flush with the exterior wall, which is very smooth. And we do actually have an example in South Frankfurt that's highly influenced by international style architecture on West Campbell Street. There was another style of house that came out of World War II. We call it minimal traditional, right? These are small, simple forms, not highly ornamented. They were really mass produced to meet the housing demand after World War II. And you can find these in Frankfurt too, like this example on Ewing Street. And finally, we're getting to the end. I'm going to close with mid-century modern, which was really kind of a reflection of the international style that was kind of made more mainstream for the masses. It's also a very kind of organic but less formal style, clean, simple lines. Was looking for examples in Frankfurt, did not come across any. Let me know where they are. But I did find some in Lexington that I'll share with you. This one was featured recently on a program that the Bluegrass Trust did. This was designed by Richard Eisenhower, and they recently did a virtual tour of a number of his designs in Lexington, which I highly encourage you to look for the recording because it was really good. So you can see here, we've got this kind of horizontal massing, low pitched roof. built of natural materials. These houses also had kind of broad expanses of uninterrupted wall surface, and sometimes doors were recessed. Here we've got recessed windows underneath here. And then when you did see a gabled roof, right, like this one, it was generally still very flat. And oftentimes they would tuck windows in up underneath here. So now we're at the end. Did I go really far over my time? Maybe we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. I don't know. Jen, do you have any questions?
I do actually. And I think I might have it, but I'm going to utilize this time. Talking about the bungalows, you know, that one slide you had with the example of like 8 different styles of bungalows, and there was so much variation in them. Is it strictly the porch that makes it bungalow?
No, it's not. What makes it bungalow basically is the 1 story or 1.5 story plan, right?
Okay.
They did most typically have a porch, sometimes more than one. But if you don't see it in the front, you might find it in the back, right?
Okay.
And I think the pictures I showed you,
there were just so many different styles there.
yeah.
I mean,
One would be, I would call this storybook style, because we've got this asphalt roof that looks like a thatched roof, right?
yeah.
And we have this entry here, doesn't really quite qualify as a porch, but I bet
No.
if you look at the plan for this house, it probably had a back porch or a screened in porch, which was pretty common feature. If it was super small, it didn't always have a porch. Here it's over on the side with a pergola on the top.
Right.
This one is prairie style. And maybe this area here is wide enough that you could almost get a couple chairs on there. But again, maybe it has a screened porch or a porch room in the back. A lot of times it depends on, like I said, the regional variation.
Mm-hmm.
They can be very weather dependent too. In Chicago, the Chicago bungalow developed its sort of form because city lots were only 35 feet wide. And so they ended up having a very kind of long and narrow, almost a shotgun orientation on their lawn, right? And what would normally be a porch, because Chicago winters are so harsh, ends up being that front room that has the windows all the way around it.
Around it.
So yeah, there's variations like that.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
if you go to California, you're going to see bungalows that have a variety of porches, because you're going to be living outside as much as inside. And so you're going to have your choice of porches to use, right?
yeah, that makes sense. Vicki, this has been amazing. And I really hope we can just post this on the city website, like for people to, because it's really special to see all the different styles in our own community.
Yeah, it really is kind of
Yeah.
fun to work on it, and remind myself of that too. We have a lot of really great things here in Frankfort.
Yeah, so hopefully we can do that without moving mountains to get it up there. I don't know what it takes, but.
Hey, Vicki,
Yes.
Nicole had a question on Facebook. Her dad asked, what about, let's see what he said. What about Dutch Colonial?
That falls into the colonial revival era. And a lot of those were built in the 20s, right? And I showed you that example that was designed by Leo Oberwerth that has the gambrel style roof over on Conway Street. Some people might put that in the Dutch colonial category just because it's got that gambrel roof. Really common in the 20s. Let's see if I can find my slide here of colonial revival through the decades. I hope I'm not making anybody dizzy. I might be, I'm making myself dizzy. Here we go, right? When you get to 1920, you've got colonial revival. This is kind of the classic Dutch colonial there. And you saw it in a lot of plan books, Sears and others, they all had Dutch colonial styles. Any other questions out there? No. Okay, well, I did put my phone number and email at the end of the presentation, although I may not have pulled that one up. So if you think of something later, you can email me or call me, and I would love to chat with you.
Thank you, Vicki. It was wonderful.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Thanks so much. And thanks, Jordan, for all your help. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Very good job. I loved it.
Thanks. All right. I'll see you guys later.
All right, see ya.
Bye.